All right, welcome to Warchant.com. I am joined by Corey S. Clark, senior writer at Warchant.com. And Corey, we're going to start up a new segment, maybe about once a week or so. We're going to call it a hot topic, something to pass the time in the off season. And in a lot of this, I want to take feedback from the fans. And it's my bad. I don't know the name offhand of the user who started a thread last week about the best Florida State teams to not win a national championship, and it created a lot of good dialogue, good debates on the message board. So when I saw that, came with the idea of the hot topics. I go, well, who knows better those teams back during that era than, of course, Corey S. Clark to discuss that. So you've got accompanying this video, you've got a write up, and it was good because you go through a lot of these teams, what they brought to the table. I was glad you even threw the 1980 team in there because I think a lot of people forget of them because they really weren't in that era. Right. They were before the primary from 87 on, but you made some very good arguments for them as well, why they have a great case to maybe be one of those teams that we're discussing here. But go ahead. First of all, kind of discuss what you looked at to decide this. And I know you kind of, at the end, you give your top two classes in this write-up, or top two.
Yeah. Classes. So, the thing with the 14 years is literally, I would say, other than like maybe 88 and 95, those two teams, like, you can't argue with it. Like the 88 Florida State team got trounced in the opener. And then the 95 team, even if Warwick Dunn gets in against Virginia, I feel like they probably still lose to Florida. And so they weren't going to make the championship game that year. So they weren't going to win it. And I don't know if they won any part of that Nebraska team anyway. That Nebraska team was nuts. But every other year, the 12 other years, I feel like you could make a case, and I did actually, there's one or two games, obviously one or two games. They only lost 2 games. They didn't lose more than 2 games throughout the decade. But 1 or 2 plays even that probably cost them a national title. Obviously, we know the wide rights. But even like 89, if they beat Southern Miss, which was not a good Southern Miss team, I think they finished 4-7. And they couldn't cover kicks that day. If they could have just covered kicks and not given Southern Miss the ball at the 30 a couple of times, they win that game. As good as Brett Favre was. 1987, if he kicks the PAT, I think they win the national championship. 1990, if they beat Auburn, and they were up 17-7 at Auburn, and they had a chance going in for a game-winning, to put the game away, and they tried a fumble Ruski that didn't work. Afterwards, Bowden said, we all remember the punt Ruski, obviously. This was one of them that backfired. Afterward, Bowden said the defensive lineman literally just fell down, he was so exhausted that he just fell to a knee, and the ball happened to be right there. It was one of those fumble Ruskis where the quarterback would put it under the guard and then run around left end, and then the offensive tackle was supposed to come pick it up and run with it while that play was still legal. And the defensive lineman for Auburn literally was just so tired he fell on the ball, and they lose that game. I think Casey Weldon also had like a 25-yard sack, which was nuts, on a 4th down, which gave Auburn the game-winning field goal. But anyway, so you go through it, even 98, if Winky doesn't get hurt, they win the national championship. 97, if they go in for the touchdown instead of settling for the field goal at Florida, they win a national championship. So I kind of wanted to point that out. Like, all of these teams were awesome. I think 95 and 88 is the only ones that you can say, okay, it wasn't just one play in the Miami game. It was 25 plays. And the 95 team not only lost to Virginia, but then, got down pretty big to Florida, made it respectable, but Florida, I think, was the better team. The 12 other teams, 2 of them won it. The 10 other teams had a chance. So that's kind of what part of the column was just talking about that, kind of illuminating how close all those teams were. And when you look at it through that prism, right, Gene, it's hard to pick the best one.
No,
they were all really good.
I agree completely on that. I mean, all those teams. Even you didn't mention 2000. Snoop Minnis goes to class, and you probably win that national championship as well. Or Mark Richt doesn't get hired by Georgia, you probably win that. I mean, there's a couple things simply happen in that one, for the fact that the number 1 offense in the country that year effectively got shut out. I mean, Oklahoma had a great defense, but not that good.
No. Jabbar Walker drops a pass that's a walk. Well, not his speed. It's a sprint in touchdown, but it's a crossing route about 25 yards. He's already beaten the safety. That's a touchdown, and it hits him right in the chest, and he drops it. I think it was Robert Morgan that had one go through his hands in the end zone. Yeah, so you make those 2 plays. You make one of those plays, you probably win the game.
The most painful one for me, and I think the Robert Morgan one, because I remember someone came out with a Photoshop deal afterward. They had the crystal ball falling out of his hands on that one that he dropped in the end zone.
Right.
Which is very apropos at the time. All right, Corey, so I want to get into your top 2, starting with number 2, and I'll go ahead and let you make your case. I'll play a little devil's advocate. I say both of those would be in my top 5, I would say. So I'm not like a big, like you said, any of those 12 teams you mentioned, I'd be fine with it. But so let's start with, you had 1996 was what you thought was the number 2 best Florida State team that did not win a national championship. Go ahead and make your case for that.
Well, I think it was probably the best defense they've had. The defensive line had 3 top 12 picks in the draft, 3 first-round picks, and then the other guy, Greg Spires, played a decade in the NFL. You had Warwick Dunn, you had Andre Cooper, E.G. Green. Peter Warwick was a redshirt freshman that made plays on that team. He wasn't featured by any means, probably not nearly as much as he should have been, but he made plays. So you had E.G. Green, Andre Cooper, Peter Warwick. You had a very good offensive line that included Walter Jones, right, and Trey Thomas. So it included one Hall of Famer and one kind of almost borderline Hall of Famer up front. It just was not good enough, in my opinion. Probably even still, I don't want to criticize Thad Busby. I think he was probably the worst of those dynasty era quarterbacks, but he was still good enough. I mean, they won that game. They beat Florida with Thad Busby at quarterback, throwing for probably 130 yards or whatever he threw for. But they had Warwick Dunn, they had Rock Preston, and they had an unbelievable defense. And they just got they deserved the national championship. That game, that win over Florida is one of the best wins a Florida State team has ever had. That was a loaded Florida team, and they had to beat them twice because Nebraska couldn't take care of business. I think they beat that Nebraska team by a couple of scores. Personally, I think it would have obviously been much easier than dealing with that Florida team again. But not only did they have to play Florida again, because Nebraska blew it in the Big 12 championship game, which it was the first year, by the way. Like, of course, that was the year. They couldn't have waited until 97 to debut that. But then also, if Arizona State wins in the Fiesta Bowl the night before, 2 nights before, whenever that game was played, Florida still would want to beat Florida State to keep Florida State from winning a national title. But Florida would have had no shot at a national title that night if Arizona State hadn't lost to Ohio State. But Arizona State and Jake Plummer did lose to Ohio State, I think, in the final minute, like in the final 20 seconds. And then all of a sudden, Florida's not only getting the revenge factor, but they got a chance to win their first national championship. So they were really hungry, and they were also really good, and they were also looking for revenge. And Florida State had a bit of the flu. All that coalesced in a 52-20 loss.
That reminds me of all the conspiracy theories that the Florida State players ate at some Cajun restaurant that was owned by a Gator fan or something, and they were all given food poisoning and all these crazy things that came out of that. I don't know if you remember hearing that one. But here on the other side, I would say that first of all, number one, 100% I agree. That team deserved a national championship. You beat the number 1 team in the country at the end of the year. That should be it. You shouldn't have to have a rematch. They don't get a mulligan. It doesn't work like that. You were undefeated. So, I mean, you're right. And a lot of confluence of crazy events had to happen to get that second shot. And they got it, and they won it. But here, how I play devil's advocate, I'd be like, first of all, I don't think the schedule was that great that year. Miami was down that year. This was not your juggernaut Miami team. They really didn't play anybody all season long, really with a pulse. The defense was great, but I'll say one thing in my mind. When Florida State got that rematch with Florida, I knew they weren't going to win before the illness and anything else. Even without the illness, I don't think they'd win that game. Florida State played a perfect game against Florida at home. I thought everything went well. And the thing I remember being in that stadium that I kept noticing was a very windy day. I don't know if you remember that, Corey. Every time Danny Werfel tried to chuck the ball deep, he had those speedy receivers were deep a couple times. He couldn't get the ball there. The ball would just die up in the air. That was not a factor in the Dome. They had perfect conditions. Spurrier had a month to prepare for that thing. I don't think they were going to win that game regardless. So in my mind, Florida State, all things being equal, wasn't as good as Florida. Was it fair they got that rematch? Absolutely not. But to me, wasn't the best team. And I felt at the end of the year, I felt undoubtedly Florida State was the best team in the country.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I will say that, especially in the early part of the dynasty, Florida State would always lose a game early. And then by the end of the year, you're like, man, there's nobody that could beat this team right now. But instead of playing for the national championship, they're playing the Blockbuster Bowl or something. And back then, if people don't remember, the bowl system, especially in the 80s and early 90s, was really screwy. You accepted bowl bids with 2 games left in the regular season. People were inviting you 2 or 3 weeks left in the season. And so you had to decide right then, are we going to play in the Orange Bowl? I guess we'll play in the Orange Bowl. We'll get the winner of the Big 12. Well, then, you couldn't match up 1 versus 2. That's what made that Miami-Penn State game so unique, was because for the first time in my lifetime, it was an actual 1 versus 2. It was 2 independents, so they didn't have any bowl ties. So they were like, you know what? instead of Miami going and beating somebody in the Orange Bowl and Penn State going to beat somebody in the Sugar Bowl, why don't we just play each other? And that's what they did. And that's what made that game so unique, but it was obviously very rare back then. So that's kind of, obviously we know that if the playoffs were alive back then, I feel like Florida State would have 4 or 5 more championships, at least a couple more. But yeah, I can see that you wouldn't, it wasn't like, say, 87 or even 88 or 89 for that matter, where you're like, man, Florida State at the end of the year was crushing everyone. I just think that Florida team was, I think, the best team they've ever had. I think that's the best Gator team that's ever been.
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt.
And Florida State was up on them 17-0, and he kind of held on because, again, I think they were hamstrung a little bit at quarterback. Not a little bit, a lot when you look back at that time. And somebody brought up a point to me, Gene, I never even thought about. But if, like, Felder stays on the team in 92, instead of when he loses the battle to Charlie, he just sticks with football. Or if Winky's there or somebody else is there, Danny Cannell isn't getting reps as a true freshman in 92. And he would have been a fifth-year senior quarterback on the 96 team.
Interesting.
And I don't think that Florida game is close. I think you could have beaten them enough, or if Randy Moss is there, you could have beaten them enough that they wouldn't have warranted a rematch. Instead of beating them 24-21, you might have beaten them 35-21 or 38-21, and then you don't warrant a rematch. So that was more bad luck. But yeah, it was tough to ask to beat those guys twice.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up because my best friend Drew, I think you've met, always brings this up to me in this game, and he points out when they were up 17-0. I don't know if you remember this. Florida State intercepted them. I think a ball was tipped.
Yeah.
There was an interception in their territory, so they're getting ready to blow the doors off of Florida at that point. If you go back and look, there was a phantom interference call on Florida. I think it was a defensive hold or phantom interference. You go back and look, there was nothing there at all. It was just a flag out of nowhere. It's almost like he took pity on Florida at that point because they were getting blown out of the water. If that doesn't happen, Florida, like you said, and your point to that other thing, Florida State at that point gets that interception, they score again. It's a blowout at that point. Florida State's going to win by 2-3 touchdowns, and Florida never dropped so far in the polls they can never catch back up.
And I've always wondered on the other side of that in the 93 season, if I think it was Kes McCorvey that caught the deflected pass on 4th down to make it 31-24 at Notre Dame. Yeah. If that kid bats that down and you end up losing that game by 2 touchdowns, does that Notre Dame loss to Boston College next week propel you to number 1, or is a 2 touchdown loss too much to overcome? I remember that play. I don't remember the penalty. I remember Florida State being up 17-0 and intercepting him again as he was getting crushed again, and then them having a flag to take it away.
Right. So there's that. But let's go to your number 1. Which this team, you do have a case that they were the best team in the country at the end of the year, and that is 1992. Finished 11-1, number 2. Obviously, there's a strong case for this team, especially how they finished up the season, Corey.
Yeah, I know most people watching this remember or know about Charlie Ward's struggles, and they weren't just the first 2 games where he threw 8 picks. There were always stops and starts and hiccups. Like he got benched a couple of times, not even in those 2 games. North Carolina, I think he played really poorly. At NC State, they had 0 points until like 3 minutes left in the first half, and it never really got much better. I think their only touchdown against Miami, which was a very close game, was the kick return. Mm-hmm. So the offense wasn't clicking really at all. He had some nice moments. Obviously, the Georgia Tech game is the one that everybody remembers. But even after that game, they didn't go full time to the fast break offense. They went up to Virginia the next week and won 13-3 because Virginia just couldn't move the ball in that defense. But my point with that team is, I think if they start that season with him in the shotgun, they win every game by 2 touchdowns at least, including that Miami game. I think that was so innovative I don't even want to call it innovative. It was just so hard to defend. Nobody had a chance with it. Florida had a month to prepare for that, and Florida had some dudes on defense. And they went and played the next week and held the eventual national champions, I think, to 20 points. Well, or something thereabouts. Well, Florida State had 38 points at halftime of that game against Florida, that 92 game. So if you look at the totality of the season, you're like, okay, it wasn't really that impressive because Charlie struggled so much. You barely beat Clemson. You barely beat Georgia Tech. You only scored 1 touchdown against Miami. But I look at it in the prism of what that team was at the end of the year because they switched the offense, and it was unstoppable. Nobody stopped it. Now, again, the first game was against Maryland where they went to it, and it's like, okay, it's Maryland. I get it. But still, he had 500 yards of offense in like 2.5 quarters, and they had 800 yards in that game. They set a record for most total yards in a game in that game. And then the next week is Tulane. He plays 2.5 quarters. They put up 70. They score 69 and 70 the first 2 weeks. They do the no huddle, the fast break, and then the next week is Florida, and they have 38 in the first half. So that's kind of what I'm saying when I look at that year. That offense became unstoppable, and then the defense was great the whole season. And they were literally just one field goal away from getting, even as bad as they were offensively the first 2 months. If he makes that kick down in the Orange Bowl to tie it up at the Horn, I think Florida State's number 2 in the country going in to the bowls, and I think Florida State's in New Orleans playing Alabama instead of Miami, and I think Florida State wins that game.
I can't disagree about the end of the season. I mean, you're right. I think that's right up there with, some of these other teams, maybe 89 at the end of the year, they were the best team in the country. I don't think there's really much of a doubt about that. But here's my counter to that. And I do think you have to look at the season the whole. You mentioned that Georgia Tech game. It was a fluke for Florida State to win that game.
Sure.
They were down 21-7 in the fourth quarter. It took an onside kick. It took a 4th and 5 at the end of the game to win that. And this is a Georgia Tech team that went on to be 5-6 that season. Right. And I'll also point out, and I know it was early, and it pointed out, you should have known at that point, the coaching staff should have known, because when Charlie Ward got behind and Florida State got behind Clemson, and they went to the hurry up, of course, he rallied him there too. But this is a Clemson team they barely beat on the last drive that finished 5-6. So you had to pull it out of your butt to beat 2 5-6 teams that year. So it's hard for me to just completely discount that in the first half, but in terms of that second half of the season, I completely agree that they were the best team in the country at the end of the year.
Well, and you also have to remember, and I know you do, so I'm not talking to you like you're a 6-year-old, just to the viewer, but, that Clemson game, if your quarterback throws even one interception, you probably win by 3 touchdowns. Your quarterback literally was giving them points, and he threw 4 interceptions on the road in Death Valley at night, and they were down 20-17, I think, with 3 or 4 minutes left, 5 minutes left, yeah. And all of a sudden they do what they do. He does what he did, and he goes down the field and scores. And then the Georgia Tech game, the same thing. He had thrown 2 interceptions. I think he'd thrown for like 50 or 80 yards going into the fourth quarter. Finally, they say, you know what? Let's just unleash it. I know they had benched him for Cannell, too. Let's just unleash it. He has 220 of their 221 yards in the fourth quarter. Mm-hmm. He totaled 220 yards in a quarter. And that was the Georgia Tech wasn't good. That defense wasn't terrible, though. And that's equivalent of 880 yards for a game that he did in one quarter. And it was just like, you just wish, and I know Bowden always loved the eye. They did tinker with some things that year for Charlie. They went to more 3 wides, which they had never done before. It was usually just fullback, tailback, tight end. But that year they took William off the field a good bit, or they put him at tight end, William Floyd, for some of the season. And they went to 3 wide receivers, but they still kept him under center. For whatever reason, Charlie, it just didn't work as well with under center. And you wish they would have realized that before November. Because, so, yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, that they didn't, all these teams are going to have a few warts, right? Like any team, you're going to be like, well, the 89 team, who's right up there too, it's like, well, they lost to a bad Southern Miss team.
Yeah.
I think this 92 team, I think that 4-game stretch, starting with Maryland, ending with Nebraska, was probably the best 4-game stretch that any team had ever played for Florida State. And I think it gives you an idea of what it would have been for the whole season. Now, a lot of those guys did come back and win a national championship the next year, but Marvin didn't. And so, again, their 2 leading tacklers that year were Marvin Jones and Derek Brooks, which is a nice combination. It tells you a little bit about the talent on the defense when those are your 2 leading tacklers. Corey Sawyer had 7 picks. It was just they had 13 guys off that defense drafted. 8 were in the first 2 rounds. So it was a loaded defense. And if the kid just makes the kick, even with all that, Gene, right? Don't you think? I personally think the 92 team, we can say 87 would have won the national title if they'd have played in the Orange Bowl. But, they got lucky to beat Nebraska in the Fiesta Bowl.
All right, lucky, I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that in a minute.
Sorry. So, but what I was going to say is they all have warts. And and there's plenty of teams that at the end of the year you think, yeah, man, I think they were the best team in the nation. I think they would have won the national championship. Me personally, I think that 92 team is in my mind, the definitive national champion. I don't know that Alabama even keeps it close. And that was a good Alabama team. I'm more confident that that team would have won that last game, the national championship game, than any of the other great Florida State teams that didn't. Just because Charlie became transcendent and they had that defense.
Yeah. No, again, I totally agree. At the end of the year, they were the best team. It's hard for me. Again, I get it. Had they done this earlier, they would have blown everybody off the map. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But, man, they really struggled to beat two very average teams at that early in the season. So that's why that's that wart that jumps out at me. But I'm going to
those days, Gene, when Clemson wasn't any good? Weren't those good days?
Clemson actually wasn't that bad at that point. They were actually pretty decent.
Yeah, they had won it, like, I think they'd won the ACC like probably 8 of the 9 years before Florida State joined the league. And then they weren't real happy that Florida State joined the league for like the next 2 decades.
Well, between that, what happened there, and the Punt-Ruski a couple of years before that, they were never the same after that. So right. Yeah, those were fun times, Corey. Maybe someday we'll see.
Well, someday.
So let me make my case for 87, and then you can go ahead and give me your reason.
Oh, all right. Okay, sure.
Let me throw out the resume for 87. Now, I may be a little biased because I was a student at the time. So to me, I have these vivid, when you're 19, 20 years old, you have just vivid memories of everything. Sure. So the 11-1, finished number 2. Okay, we all know the only loss you suffered that season was a 1-point heartbreaker to Miami, where you really outplayed them. Anybody who saw the game, you were there. You were the better team than them. Yeah. So also that season, you beat number 6 Auburn at Auburn, 34-6.
Yep.
Okay, you beat Florida and Gainesville by 2 touchdowns. You're right. They didn't blow out Nebraska, but maybe they I don't know. It's a bowl game. You never know. A little odd. They, but they did win. They came back, win the game. But here's my number one argument for this, Corey. I'm going to read this. This is going to be a long list. You know where I'm going with this. The number of players, elite players that were on the team, I don't think any Florida State team can ever match this in terms of talent across the board in this team. So it's going to be patient with me here. Sammy Smith, Edgar Bennett, Deion Sanders, Pat Carter, Danny McManus, Dexter Carter, Ronald Lewis, Pat Tomlin, Odell Higgins, Paul McGowan, Stan Shriver, Dedrick Dodge, Corian Freeman, Victor Floyd, Leroy Butler, Herb Gaynor, Terry Anthony, Marion Butts, and Martin Mayhew. I don't know if there's a team had that many elite players on one team. So for me, player for player, I thought that was the best team for its era at the time.
Yeah, and and the thing with Florida State though, Gene, is I could read off the 91 team or the 93 team or the 92 team, and it's a list of just bang, 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 great players. And the 2013 team. But the NFL is great, but it's almost like just those just concentrating on the guys that were really good college players, like Paul McGowan was a great college linebacker. And, man, you're not going to get a lot of argument or a lot of pushback from me on that 87 team. I was 12 years old. I was heartbroken walking out of that stadium because I thought that, I'd grown up. My dad kept telling me this is the year. This is the year we're going to get to 10 wins or 11 wins because I was 5 the last time they had been great in that 1980 season. And I'd never really seen it. And I started, you're 12, you start to live and die with the teams you cheer for. And so that was the season. And I was so pumped for that game. And they were up 19-3 against Miami. They outplayed them. People forget because of the 2-point conversion. But Derek Schmidt ended his career as the all-time leading scorer in NCAA history. All-time leading scorer. He was a great kicker. He missed a 31-yarder in that game, and he missed an extra point in that game.
It's unheard of.
And they were also setting up for early in the game, I think first quarter, maybe second quarter. They're setting up for like a 40-yard, 38-yard field goal. The center thinks that he hears Danny McManus, who was the holder, say, snap it. So he snaps it while McManus is looking back at Schmidt.
Oh, yeah.
It goes 50 yards the other way, and Miami has – and you're getting ready to kick a field goal. It was all this special teams debacle that happened. Deion wasn't covering Michael Irvin late in the game when it was tied. Whatever, but still, I think if he kicks the PAT there, that's a national championship, I think. But the only counter I would have is that, it wasn't like they ran roughshod over Nebraska in the Fiesta Bowl. They got down 14-0 in that game. They came back to take a lead. Then Nebraska retook the lead and was driving in to put the game away and fumbled at the 1-yard line. Now, all the credit in the world to McManus and that team for going down and getting I think it was a 99-yard drive to win the game, and he hit Ronald Lewis on 4th down. So that was the first team. of the dynasty, and it was a great team, and it's really hard for me. And man, it's like picking kids. It's hard, man. The 92 and the 87 team were both great teams. I thought, but it's hard. Yeah, you're right, because they beat Auburn 34-6, and that was a really good Auburn team.
Yeah, at Auburn. Yeah, nobody.
At Auburn, destroyed them. Like, it wasn't close.
So, yeah, there we go. I mean, it's, again, like you said, you could pick any of them, and I don't think you're wrong on that case. They're all great teams. So, everyone, I encourage you to, if you're just watching the video, check out Corey's story. He goes in a little bit more details on all the teams, including, again, I'm glad you threw in the 1980 team. Made a really good argument for that. I mean, again, I was pretty young. I wasn't even in Florida at the time. I was, a young kid in Chicago. Growing up, I kind of vaguely remember how cool it was, that team down south that had those spears on their helmets, but that's about my only memory of that team back in 1980. So
yeah, let me touch on 80 real quick.
Yeah,
so
please do.
They in two straight weeks, they had to play the number 3 team in the country. They had to go to Nebraska and play number 3 Nebraska. They beat them, I think 18-14. They got a stop near the goal line on a fumble recovery late in the game, and then the very next week they're hosting Pitt with Dan Marino, Hugh Green, Bill Fralick. Like Russ Grimm, the whole team was loaded. And Bowden always said it was probably the best team he ever beat, best team he ever played. They beat them by 2 touchdowns. And they go on to win the rest of their games, except for the one that was right before that, where they lost to Miami 10-9, where again, Bowden decided to go for 2 late in the game instead of kick a PAT. And that was a game where they fumbled the ball 7 times. Miami's only touchdown came on a pass interference back then, where it was the spot of the foul. And it was a called pass interference, controversial call, according to Bill McGrotha's story, in the end zone. So they got the ball at the 1, and Jim Kelly dove in, and that was Miami's only touchdown. And that was their only loss until Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl, same stadium, where they lost by 1 point. A really good Oklahoma team. And Miami that year was good. It wasn't a normal, like, late 70s, early 80s Miami team. They were 9-3. Oklahoma finished 7th in the country. Pitt finished 2nd in the country. Wow. Their only loss was to Florida State. That was an incredible defense. The offense was, it was still good. They threw it more than most people did back then, but Stockstill wasn't a great quarterback. But Sam Platt was the running back. They had Hardest Johnson, a receiver. But the defense had Ron Simmons, Bobby Butler, Monk, Keith Jones, and on and on and on. It was a really good defense, and one of the best in the country. I think they averaged like giving up 10 points a game. So that 80 team doesn't really ever get talked about because it doesn't fit with the dynasty, and it was 7 years before. But the season that year, Georgia ended up winning the national title. They went undefeated. They barely beat Florida, who that Florida State team crushed. They had to beat Florida with like a minute left on a desperation pass. But Georgia played 1 ranked team all season.
Wow.
All season. Florida State played 6, including 3 of the top 10 teams, or 4 of the top 10 teams. Just something. It was just one of those typical early 80s Florida State schedules. So that 1980 team, it kind of gets lost to history a little bit, but it was an all-time great team that lost 2 games by a total of 2 points. Just really unfortunate. They could have been really close to winning that national. They probably would have played Georgia in the Sugar Bowl for the national title. Great
stuff, Corey. Always your knowledge is unbelievable on some of this stuff. And again, I relive those things, but I mean, you start bringing up little details like that 87 game, and I thought I remember everything, but you're right. I forgot about little detail here and there. So excellent stuff for those of us, whether we were younger, we watched them on YouTube, or we were there at the game as an adult or a student. Man, it's some fun stuff. So
you never said who was your second team? Who do you think was the second team?
You know what? I went through this. I would have to say, you know what? Here's the thing when I look at it, because I look at 91 for the first half of the season.
Yeah.
I thought 91 was the best team in the country. They had that debacle at LSU with all the injuries, and they had the 1 point, obviously wide right, and they lost their souls at that point between the injuries and that. And I think so that was not the same team at the end of the year. So I put that in that thing, but I would have to say the other one is almost 97.
Yeah.
I have to look at to me, because that loss there was a great team offensively and defensively. That loss to Florida still in my mind, I still don't understand it. I don't understand how they lost that game to Florida, especially how they gave up that many points. I know Spurrier, wasn't that when he was rotating in Brandeis?
Every play, yeah. Brandeis and Doug Johnson.
On there. I guess that's just, you got to give Spurrier credit for scoring that many points against a really good defense. And then for Florida State, they choked it at the end. They had a chance to put it away inside the 5. And I'll never forget talking to Mark Richt later about this, when he basically admitted on that 3rd down, they had to play. They scored earlier to Pearsall, the play action. He called the same play, and it got overruled. That he wanted to call that play, and it goes back in hindsight. If you look, Florida was set up. They had everybody in the box. That play, he said, would have been a walk. It would have been just a simple look at underhead, tossed it, and it would have been the winning touchdown. But Florida State Bobby thought that defense was so good.
Yeah.
There's no way we get this much up. There's no way they're driving the field for a touchdown to beat us. And they did. All right, really good stuff. Now, if anybody out there, a Warchant subscriber, wants to email Corey or me, or you can post on the Tribal Council with your suggestions. We're glad to hit any hot topics. And we might even get, maybe get Ira in on some of these if you got more modern stuff. I don't know. When did Ira come on the scene, Corey?
02.
02.
02, but he was, he was falling from a distance in the late 80s, early 90s. But he didn't become ingrained in Florida State until 2002.
All right. So
the glory years.
It doesn't have to be old stuff for us old guys. You can bring some modern stuff too, or
right.
Maybe talk about. I mean, one of the ones I threw out. Maybe we'll have a hot topic on. Will there be a college football season fall, and how might it look? I mean, a lot of it's speculation on our part, but we're hoping. So maybe we can throw out some ideas, something like that.
Sure.
Corey, thanks again for your time. Keep up the great work of Warchant, buddy.
All right, thanks, Gene.
You got it.